Water's work brings feminist, womanist, spiritual values and intellectual work to efforts at social change. Let me say that one more time because it's so important to us. Water's work brings feminist, womanist, spiritual values and intellectual work to efforts at social change. And Jeanette's book makes clear that the center's work, indeed Jeanette's deepest commitments, are to creating a just and sustainable world. So it's just the perfect fit for us today. Let me mention our format and then we'll get right to it. I'll make a brief introduction of our speaker, Jeanette Stokes, and she will have 20 or 25 minutes to introduce us to her book, Making the Road as We Go. And I always shamelessly hawk these books because I think they're so terrific and there's so much to be gained from reading a book like this. And it is published by the Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South. It's from 2022, Making the Road as We Go by Jeanette Stokes. So we'll make sure in the notes that this is listed and the place to get it is on their website, and we will make sure that you have that as well. We'll take notes during this presentation, and then we'll put the notes along with the video on our website under WATERtalks, and we will make them available to you by email as well, since you've signed up to be here. And please share them, share the video, share the notes, and certainly share what I hope you will agree with me, the information on the book that I think you'll want to get for yourself and perhaps for some friends. Again, I'm going to ask you to shut off your audio to cut down on noise, and you will be invited into the conversation as soon as Jeanette finishes. We'll end at the top of the hour, which will be 2:00 Eastern time to respect everybody's schedule. And then you can re-listen or point other people in the direction of this teleconference by going to Water's website, www.waterwomensalliance.org. Look under programs and teleconferences. And you'll even find one there by Melanie Morrison, who's with us today. So I invite you to go back and look at that, or if you missed it, to watch it for the first time. So we will keep the Zoom open for a few minutes after we close officially at 2:00, but the official closing time is meant for you to be able to make a graceful exit onto your next event. So we will continue conversation, those who wish for another quarter of an hour or so, depending on how it goes. So let me introduce Jeanette Stokes, and then we will hear bits and pieces of her book, Making the Road as We Go. Jeanette Stokes and I met at Grailville in Loveland, Ohio. If you've never been to Loveland, you haven't lived. It was the summer of 1976. We were just out of third grade. No, I think actually we were in divinity school, weren't we, Jeanette? You were at Duke, and I had just finished Harvard and had gone on to study in Berkeley. It was a summer to remember, 1976, because it was the US bicentennial. You'll remember the parade down the huge main street of Loveland. I think it was probably a block long. But it was a summer to remember for us, excuse me, memorable because we were part of a very unique and life-changing summer program for women studying theology. One of, I think, the great programs of all times. And these were summer programs. I just happened to have the booklets that we see how sophisticated we were in both in our preparation of these materials and in our drawings and so forth. We prepared these booklets that include pictures, vintage pictures of us, by the way, when we were in our 20s. And I won't show them at the moment, but I'm sure for a celebrity auction, they would get a lot of money, Jeanette. You know, the two of us at 20, what were we, 25? It'd be a lot. We're just a week apart in age, so we have a lot of things in common. We went that summer to Grailville from little cohorts of feminists in theological education around the country. So you can imagine how thrilled we were to meet one another in Loveland, all of us. We had the good fortune of living for 6 weeks at a women's farm and conference center in the company of the Women of the Grail. And if you don't know the Grail, it's an international organization which is dedicated to women's spirituality and political change and the arts and all kinds of good things. And really, I think Jeanette and I would both agree that the Grail had enormous shaping impact on both of us, and that our organizations, which we're sharing today, really are in some ways products of that experience that we and others in our cohorts had. And we were about 20 a year, I guess, in those programs. I had actually been there in 75 and was back in 76 just to work in the garden and to swim and to study for my comprehensive exam. So I was kind of a repeater in 76, but my own summer was 75. But there we were on this farm and conference center in the company of the Women of the Grail and other great feminists who came in for the weekend, like Nell Morton, Rosemary Radford Ruther, and others who would come in and be our faculty on the weekends. And then we participants became our own and one another's teachers, and we had great fun. We returned to our respective institutions to challenge the patriarchal status quo. Imagine what Yale got when people went back there. Imagine what Duke got. Imagine what Harvard got. Imagine, I can tell you what GTU got. They did not realize what was coming back from Grailville, from Loveland. And as one another's teachers, we also came to be one another's friends. And that was really, that's really the story as far as I'm concerned. And I read this memoir and I invite you to read it to know who Jeanette Stokes is. She was born into a white Presbyterian family with economic privilege in Tulsa, Oklahoma, studied at Smith and then Duke, as I mentioned. Her life's work to date has focused on the Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South. The Resource Center is a feminist nonprofit that includes religion, the arts, social justice, and so much more. She's written countless columns for their monthly newsletter, South of the Garden. She's compiled these into 3 collections. She's written 3 memoirs and a book on writing. Jeanette's an ordained Presbyterian minister. And what I love about her is that she's always frank. And in this book, she talks about how boringly outdated the beliefs are that so many people cling to out of habit, and the sermons are just as boring. She's an artist and a gardener, but mostly I know her as a dear friend and as a stalwart colleague to whom I turn for ideas, advice, and common sense. So welcome, Jeanette. Tell us about how we make the road as we go. Your life story published, I should say your life story to date. I don't think you're done yet. Published in 2022 by the Resource Center. Jeanette, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here. And before you go off screen, will you hold up the beige book, taupe, brownish? No, oh, yes, that's our picture. No, I want to see the cover. So the cover of this booklet that we made after the summer at Grailville, we called "There is no road ahead, we make the road as we go." And I took the title, thank you, of this book from that saying, which we picked up that summer. It's originally from a Spanish poet. I think maybe Nell Morton said something like that. And that's where the title came from. Okay, so Mary did such a good summary that we could just take questions after that. I think Mary is still spotlighted. I'm not sure. That's who I'm picking up on my speaker view. It's fine. Okay, so where did this book come from? Well, it came from my life. It also came from my friend Rachel Wooten, who bugged me for years to write about myself, which is what I thought I had been doing. She kept saying I was writing about other people, about my former husband, about my father's life, about my mother's people. So I put the word next, N-E-X-T, on my to-do list for writing projects. And it sat there for several years. And then I started writing pieces of my life story or pulling them out of things I had already written. And that went on and off for about 5 years. Mary, will someone tell me if Mary is still the speaker view? Okay, good. It's just doing that on my machine. I'm sorry. Thank you. Okay, so we settled on the title, which I've just told you about, Making the Road as We Go, because that's what we felt like we were doing, certainly once I got to seminary and into the Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South. And then we needed a cover, and I want to tell you about the cover because it's not obvious. So the photograph was taken by MJ Sharp, who's a very accomplished photographer here in Durham. And it's actually a whole spread across the front and back of the book. This is a nighttime photograph taken under the full moon at Avebury in England. So you've heard of Stonehenge. Yes, nod your heads. Yes, you've heard of Stonehenge. Avebury is a smaller circle a circle of smaller stones that's also in England. You can actually see a couple of them on the back of the book. And so I thought this picture was of excuse me, I dropped it, of the full moon coming up over the rise near the standing stones. Here you go, in the back. Well, if that had been the full moon, there wouldn't have been enough light to take the photograph. It's actually, the full moon was up overhead and that was a car coming over the rise. So I love the mystery, and there's a tiny road that you can see through this field. Okay, so we had a title and an image, and then we could print and publish the book. So this is from the prologue. I sat almost knee to knee with two Presbyterian clergymen, excuse me, John Danhoff and Haywood Holderness, who were in charge of candidates in my presbytery in Central North Carolina. They were both a good bit older than I was. In the 3 years I had spent getting a Master's of Divinity degree at Duke University, I had passed the building many times, but rarely been inside. On this particular day, the stark cinder block orange presbytery office felt somewhat unfriendly. John Danhoff, the executive presbyter, that's like a bishop, but with less power, and Haywood Holderness, chair of the committee that supervised candidates for ordination, greeted me warmly. We chatted about my background and about my request to be ordained. Then Haywood leaned forward and said something startling. The churches don't want people who look like you. I froze. Was he kidding? Was he testing me? Was he trying to scare me? Or was he simply stating the truth as he understood it? What I looked like was a small white 28-year-old woman, just over 5 feet tall. I didn't have time to find out exactly what he meant. Though I have no written record of my response, I think I said, I understand that, but that's what I'm here to change. This is the beginning of the first chapter of the book. Perhaps one reason I had the audacity to take on the challenge of changing the landscape of religion in North America was that I grew up white and the daughter of a successful physician. I was from people who made things happen. Born May 26, 1951, just a week before Mary Hunt, I lived most of my growing up years in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where my father was an obstetrician and gynecologist and my mother was a homemaker. We were active in the local Presbyterian church, at least my mother and I were. I attended public schools, learned ballet and piano, and eventually graduated from an all-white, largely all-white public school in 1969. Mother was from generations of prosperous Texas ranchers about an hour south of Dallas. Daddy grew up in Savannah. His people had been Georgia dirt farmers and working class folk for as long as he could remember. And he intended to change all of that and better himself, which he did. And so the book goes on to tell you about my growing up years in Tulsa, my years at Smith College, the fact that I attended Amherst, which was still all male, for my senior year. And that's what made me a feminist. Eating breakfast with 1,200 18 to 22-year-old men changed my perspective on them. It also tells you about my moving to Durham, entering Duke Divinity School in the fall of '74. And it was my good fortune that that was the semester that Duke Divinity School opened a women's center, thanks to some of the women's students. I worked as the director of that women's center at Duke Divinity School during one of my years as a seminary student. It also tells you more about Grailville, and Mary gave you a good introduction, and I'll tell you a little more. So after my, one of the summers while I was at seminary, I spent between my second and third years, I went to what I always have called feminist theological summer camp. What I learned and experienced there did shape my work. It was called SQUAG, Seminary Quarter at Grailville. It was sponsored by the Grail and held at their beautiful retreat center in Loveland, which is near Cincinnati, Ohio. Wave at me if you've ever heard of Grailville, so I'll know sort of where we are, about half of you. Okay. Grailville is owned by the Grail, an international movement founded by Roman Catholic women in the Netherlands in 1921, so it's 100 years old, over. The American branch of the Grail was given a 360-acre Ohio farm in 1944 in order to establish a spiritual community. They were sort of going to be like an order or the Beguines. Operating much like a convent, though not officially sanctioned by the church nor run by nuns, the women managed their new community and agrarian life with discipline and grace. They were guided by a core group of leaders who they all made pledges of poverty, chastity, and obedience to one another. The women of Grailville planted fields, tended livestock, prayed the liturgy of the hours, and nurtured one another in Christian faith while offering educational programs to Catholic women from around the country. The programs were focused on Christian values of peace, justice, and care of the earth. Not only did the Grail women run the farm, maintain the buildings, and grow much of their own food, they renovated a barn to create a worship space they called the oratory. They wrote their own liturgies and only imported a priest to say the Catholic Mass. A hardy bunch, several of the original group remained on the farm for 60 or 70 years. Others traveled the world to teach or serve the poor. Where they were, they created faithful, responsible communities that respected the earth and all of its creatures. Then, after Vatican II and with the growing women's movement, the Grail women became more ecumenical, democratic, and experimental in the ways they managed their communal life, educated others, and served in the world. They then focused their programs on social justice, feminist theology, liberation theology, and environmental issues. So by the time Mary and I were there, they were running the seminary quarter at Grailville, which was directed by the inimitable Jeanette Calvin. And I want to tell you just a little bit about her because she was such a character. Born Jewish and educated at the University of Chicago, Jeanette converted to Roman Catholicism as a young adult, but always said she was Jewish and Catholic. She joined the Grail in Chicago when she was still young and lived her adult life at Grailville. Nearly 60 years old when I met her in 1976, she was the mastermind behind the SQUAG program, though she shared leadership with two younger women that summer. One day, I stood chatting with Janet while she watered and pruned the plants in one of her many flower boxes. Recognizing a lovely purple trailing plant with pointed leaves spilling over the side of one of the boxes, I said proudly, "That's Wandering Jew." Short, feisty Janet looked at me, her intense eyes framed with her graying pixie haircut, and said, "Jeanette, learn the proper name. It's Tricantia. How would you like for us to call something Wandering Presbyterian?" I never forgot the lesson. I actually imparted it to someone else this week. So while I was in seminary, I read a lot of standard Christian theology and more feminist theology. And by the time I started my third and final year of seminary, I was dedicated to feminism and religion as my professional interests. The summer at Grailville had more or less commissioned me to work in that field, as it did Mary Hunt, as it did Mary Condren, who visited that summer and has become Ireland's preeminent feminist theologian, and many others who were there. Back at Duke for my last year, I wondered to myself a lot, learning about the history of theology is fine and reading theology is fine, but when are we going to write our own theology? That's when it occurred to me that It was not a matter of permission. No one was going to say to me, okay, Jeanette, it's your turn now. So I started without knowing the rules and began writing theology out of my own experience. I'm not sure I would have survived being a feminist at Duke Divinity School without the support of a woman named Helen Crotwell. I spent hours in her office in the chapel basement, where she was the associate chaplain to the university. I was relating the most recent outrageous statement by some seminary professor or faculty member. Again and again, she would say to me, no one will ever thank you for what you're doing, but what you are doing is really important. Just keep doing it. Sometime during my last semester at Duke, I went to see Helen to talk about my future. I didn't have a plan and didn't have the first idea about where I was going to live or exactly what I was going to do for work. I found Helen in her office, and which I always liked, large windows looking out at trees beyond, letting in more light than in the rest of that building. Helen had arranged the room with her large wooden desk up against the wall, so it would never be between her and other people. Maybe I should get a job in a local church, I suggested, almost in desperation. It made sense. I had all the training and would have a degree to go with it. Helen replied that she had never heard me say anything to indicate that I wanted to be a parish minister. I must have then asked, so what else am I going to do? Because I remember Helen looked at me through her oversized glasses and said, why don't you do something no one else is going to do? I waited for her to tell me what that was, but she didn't. She didn't know any more than I did. So I graduated from Duke Divinity School in May of 1977. Since none of my friends were interested in attending the main large Duke graduation ceremonies, we just showed up for the ceremony in the Alumni Memorial Common Room in the Divinity School. As I recall, we stood around in a big circle and then in clumps. As the dean called our name, each student approached the dean, shook his hand, and received his or her diploma. We only had 2 genders that we knew of. Once I had mine in my hand, I walked back to my place, turned to my friends and said, they'll be sorry. What I meant was that I intended to use the degree to undo some of the things that the faculty held dear. I was interested in changing the landscape of religion in America. For starters, I wanted to change the images used for God, the sexist language used in churches, and the male domination among clergy and denominational leaders. That was 77 when I graduated. I intended to shake things up in ways that promised to make some of the dignified elder faculty members' bookcases rattle. And that was before I became active in queer issues and economic justice. So the summer after seminary, I was interested in continuing the work I had done at Duke Divinity School in the Women's Center, do something for my peers, for women who had finished seminary and were entering ordained ministry in Protestant denominations. So it seemed to me I should ask them what they needed. I arranged visits with some of them, and they told me that they needed connection and support. They wanted to know there were other women out there somewhere who knew they existed and cared about how they were doing. And they wanted to get together with other clergy women from time to time. They wanted colleagues. I was already familiar with women's centers such as the University of Massachusetts, the one at Duke Divinity School where I had worked. I corresponded with or met staff from the feminist theological centers that existed already in Boston, Chicago, and in Berkeley. It seemed to me that my clergy friends needed a program focused on connecting and supporting them. And I thought I might just have the wherewithal to create such an entity. When I ran my idea past some friends, they liked it. So a month or 2 after graduation, I found an attorney. Together, we figured out how to set up a nonprofit and the Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South was born. Helen Crotwell, the associate minister at Duke, and one of my seminary friends, Sue Parkerson, and I agreed to be the original 3 Resource Center trustees. The lawyer filed all the legal papers, and in August of 1977, official papers arrived saying that the Resource Center for Women and Ministry in the South was incorporated in the state of North Carolina. I kept saying to anyone who would listen, look, we exist. I moved to Greensboro, North Carolina, which is 50 miles away from Durham, in that fall of 77, and set up the Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South in the spare bedroom of my apartment. I designated a desk, a cardboard file box, and a card file for the office systems. I wrote names and addresses of people interested in feminism and religion on 3x5-inch cards and alphabetized them in the little card file box. My first idea for a project to do was to honor the 125th anniversary of the ordination of Antoinette Brown Blackwell, a congregational woman who many recognize as the first ordained woman in the United States. I created a biography of her, Xeroxed it, and sent it around to some people I thought might be interested. They wrote back all of this on paper and said, some of them said they were. So I began to have participants in the Resource Center. And as that contact list grew, the next logical step was to figure out how to communicate with them regularly. A newsletter was the obvious answer. A wise friend, Diane Tennis, encouraged me to make it different from all those other newsletters that she received as a bureaucrat in the Presbyterian Church in the South. So I decided to list a lot of events that might be of interest to feminists in religion, not just the ones that we sponsored. The publication needed a name. And in the summer of 1978, I was out for a walk around the park in my neighborhood. Crossing Elm Street in Greensboro, it came to me. We should call the newsletter South of the Garden. I remembered Out of the Garden, the title of a feminist song by Dory Elvey that we sang in our inclusive language worship services at Duke. It described what it felt like to be women living in the ever-changing landscape of gender roles and expectations, and included my favorite line: I'm in the water, but the bathtub is gone. South of the Garden was also the name. So it was because we intended to focus on the South, and also because my mother had always called the Interdenominational Center at 475 Riverside Drive in New York, where the Presbyterians had their national offices, she'd always called it Heaven on the Hudson. In North Carolina, we were south of heaven, or south of Eden, south of the garden. We had bits of money from a couple of Presbyterian women's organizations that helped us print and mail the first newsletter. Volume 1, number 1, was published in October 1978. It was distributed free of charge for the first year in an attempt to build readership. We didn't start charging until the next fall, when we set the subscription rate at $4 per year. A few months later, I rented an office in downtown Greensboro and rented a mailbox in the nearby post office. Having an office, a mailbox, a tax-exempt status by then, and a newsletter made the Resource Center a going concern. I worked for the Resource Center for the first 5 years for free because we didn't have any money. I had other jobs to support me, a campus ministry job at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in the early days. The Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South never had a 3 to 5 year plan. We followed our noses and interests, and the interests of the people who showed up for our programs. From the beginning, we were interested in justice for women in the church and in the world. We focused on a few issues at a time and responded to what was happening in the culture around us. Since we were interested in supporting women who were in or entering ministry in the early years, we sponsored a series of annual Women in Ministry conferences and invited participants who understood their lives and work as ministry, and we invited feminist theologians to speak, such as Rosemary Ruther, Phyllis Tribble, Carter Hayward, Katie Cannon, Mary Hunt, and others. Lots of Protestant and Roman Catholic women attended our programs. Sometimes whole groups of women from one denomination or another would need extra support. In the early 1980s, when the Southern Baptist Convention took a turn to the hard right and fired all the women ministers in its institutions, we were flooded with Baptist feminists who didn't know what to do next. Eventually, many of them found work in other areas of the country or in other denominations. In the early years, we paid attention to women in ministry, but then expanded to include more general interest feminist programming on creativity, spirituality, and social justice. Today, we deliberately try to include women from different generations. We welcome young and old, queer and straight, religious and not so religious people. So Mary, do you think that's enough for now? How are we doing? I have a
Yeah,
little.
we're fine. Why don't you, you might want to make just one last comment about what's happening at the moment, and then we'll open it for Q&A. If you,
Okay.
just a summary comment, what
Sure.
you all are doing at this point, and
Right.
then
So
we'll open it immediately.
we have been a predominantly white, not entirely white, but a predominantly white queer and straight organization through the years. And in the last decade have taken on educating ourselves in anti-racist work, including workshops led by Melanie Morrison, who's on this call. Created things like a reading race group for white women who were not up to speed on the history, the despicable history of this country over the last 400 plus years. And we have tried to figure out how to offer the communication networks and organizational support that we are privileged to have to people of color who are doing things that might need a little support. So for instance, at the moment, we're working on an African-American quilting conference for this summer that will take place in the middle of June. We are working on a film about an activist in North Carolina, Jerry Ann King Johnson, who is African-American and lives in a Warren County in North Carolina, which it has a historically a large Black population, but the little town she lives in is still run by white people. And we have done a lot of programs on creativity, writing, art, publishing books like this one and others. I'm a math major originally because I don't spell perfectly. So becoming a writer in my adult life and publishing books were things that I really never imagined I would do. I invite you to our website, which is www.rcwms.com. Maria, maybe you would type that into the chat, and look around at our programs and our publications. I'll also say that last year, Melanie, was it just last year? We published one of Melanie's books, which is called Letters from Old Screamer Mountain.
It was just last year.
Wow. In the pandemic, does anybody else have that problem? Time is not like it used to be. It's just like, was it last year? Or was it 5 years ago? Yeah. So have a look at our website. Thank you.
Great. So Jeanette Stokes, thank you very much. Making the road as we go. Jeanette has given us just the barest of introductions to what is really a very, in my view, very lengthy and almost 250-page memoir for someone who's so young. That's a lot. I think that the work of the center has been personally meaningful for me and for so many. I want to thank you publicly for that and thank your staff for the support, and simply say that we really have lots of work to do. And so what we do going forward, I think, is as important as what we have done in the past. And the people who pick up that work will really be the most, will be the ones who will decide what that is. But it just reminds me over and over again of the impact of small things like the seminary corridor at Grailville. And in that vein, I'd like to simply recognize with great delight the presence of Nancy Richardson with us, who is also an ordained minister, and she is one of the people who was on the staff of the seminary corridor from fairly early on, if not from the beginning. And Nancy is someone who knows the Grail because she's part of the Grail, one of the Protestant members of the Grail. She might want to correct the notion of poverty, chastity, and obedience. I don't think that the Grail ever had those. That the Grail is what's called in Catholic a pio unio, or a pious union, not to be confused with the impious unions that many of us have in our own private lives. But that they didn't take vows like that, but the nucleus of the Grail had a commitment to celibacy. So Nancy can correct other things there that she knows out of the history. But I'd recommend the book of Janet Calvin, Women Breaking Boundaries, which tells the great story of the Grail and the great story of the great Janet Calvin. So I only regret that she died before at 102, I believe, before Zoom. So we haven't had a program with her. And you can also, by the way, just to shout out all these people, Melanie Morrison's book was featured last year, and you can find that on our website. So if you want to go back and look at that tremendous work that Melanie's doing, especially in anti-racism.
Mary, I want to say something else about the organizations that other women created. So Nancy Richardson worked for years in Boston on the feminist. Say the name properly.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Women's Theological Center.
Women's Theological Center in Boston. And Melanie Morrison created with her mother and her partner the Levin Center in Michigan.
Yes, and I believe April is here. Another Levin.
Yes, with April Allison.
Yes, April. Welcome.
And these were all smallish, as institutions go, freestanding nonprofits that, and at one point, I think Sandra Smith, who is on this Zoom, also created one in Asheville. Sandra, say the proper name of it.
Holy Ground.
Holy Ground. There were as many as a dozen of these sister centers around the country at one point in time. Just like small businesses in any town or city, they are hard to keep alive. People run out of money, they run out of energy, they run out of wanting to do it. And so it's a fluke, really, in my life that I've worked for the Resource Center for Women and Ministry in the South for roughly 45 years. I got tired in the middle and took 2 years off, but all the rest of it's life. And it reminds me, when people say young people say to me they want to set up something like this, I say to them, I say two things. If you start it, you need to stick with it for a while. And secondly, who's gonna support you while you do it? Because these are not money-making efforts. I think that Sandra and Melanie and I all did draw some salary, shake your heads, from our organizations. I don't know if Mary and Diane have ever gotten paid anything for water. You ever gotten paid for the work you do at water?
Oh yes, we make our living here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is why you live in a 10,000 square foot house. Yeah. You don't.
Right. Yeah, these are not get rich quick schemes, but they should, it seems to me, be sustaining people in a well, there's something that goes with it too, which is a choice of lifestyle.
Well, yes. So these organizations sustain the people they serve, and the people they serve sustain the organizations. And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was from a woman named Jean Entine. Nancy, did you know her in Boston? She was the director of the Massachusetts Governor's Commission on the Status of Women, and the Democrat got voted out and the Republican got voted in, moved all of that whole commission out. And the commission stayed together with Jean as their director and said, we are now the Massachusetts Governor's Commission on the Role and Status of Women in Exile. And they kept going as a freestanding nonprofit. But anyway, she told me early on in this work that foundations were not going to be our bread and butter. And in fact, I think all of us who've done this kind of work have found, and any of you connected with women's programs anywhere or gender programs anywhere, there's not a lot of money for it. The Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South was a little too religious for the secular foundations and a little too progressive for the religious foundations. We have had grants over the years. I'll speak of the Carpenter Foundation, which has been very generous to the Resource Center and to Water, but it won't keep an organization alive. It was the individuals who loved our work and made contributions. I mean, there's some of you on this call that have been making contributions to the Resource Center since it started. And so I just want to say thank you. That's what keeps these organizations, communities, really. I mean, that's what we develop, is communities of people who live and learn and worship and fuss and grow together. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Melanie's shaking her head. Nancy knows
Yeah.
a lot about that too. And
Yeah.
what you say, I think, certainly goes for Water. Let me, with that, open the floor for questions, comments, conversation. Please use the reaction button at the bottom right hand of your screen and use the raise hand, lower hand button. I've just raised my hand. Now I'm lowering my hand.
Right.
And please use that. And Pamela Miller will be first. Are you on? No, Pamela doesn't have a question. I thought I saw it. Okay, Pat Boswell will be first. And unmute yourself, please, and tell us your name, maybe where you're from, and we'll try to move right along. Yeah.
Pat Boswell from Greensboro. And first of all, I'd like to commend Jeanette on one thing that she did not mention today, which is the work she's done with aging in women, which is really important in this era. But I wanted to ask Jeanette, in light of some of the reactionary and backward moving forces in the country around gay issues and women's issues, what do you see as the next big challenge for the Resource Center?
First, I want to tell all of you, I hope this is all right with Pat. Pat is, this is a little uncomfortable. It's drawing some from a male historian, but Pat's brother was the Yale historian John Boswell.
Of blessed memory.
Of blessed memory. William and Mary has recently named a building after him, which is only the beginning of the recognition he deserves. In North Carolina, many of you don't live in North Carolina. In North Carolina, we have a lieutenant governor right now who is a religious man who is organizing very conservative religious folk around hatred of queer people. It is just horrifying. And we are probably going to have in less than 2 years a campaign for governor in which he will run for governor. And our splendid attorney general will run against him. It's terrifying. One of my progressive United Church of Christ minister friends went to one of these gatherings sort of as a mole so he could find out what it was like. And they were organizing these very conservative, reactionary folk to file for office. And they talked about 80 people over the course of a year or so into filing for offices in North Carolina. A few of them actually got elected. I mean, it's really scary. 50 years ago, we thought that we had just successfully changed the world. In fact, things were getting better. Incarceration rates were going down. And since then, you know the country we have created. We have the largest income gap in this country since the robber barons were in charge. So it's terrifying. I think that the challenges, which is what you ask about, are to nurture people like us who've been in the struggle for justice for a long time, figure out ways as we age. I have friends who are in their 80s and 90s who are still activists. They're not necessarily out on the mall in Washington all day under the blazing sun, but they're calling and writing and organizing people. So nurturing people so they can keep going as long as possible, and bringing along younger people who want to be involved in the struggle for justice in this country and help them not be discouraged. This is a really, I mean, the people who graduated from college during the Trump years, some of them don't even want to be involved in politics of any kind, and because of what they saw. One of my favorite parts of working at the Resource Center for Women and Ministry in the South is that we've always had interns, and a few years ago we received a bequest large enough to support our internship program, and every year we have 2 or 3 interns, as Water does, sometimes young, sometimes middle-aged, but the young people who are attracted to the Resource Center are people who are already engaged in the struggle for justice for all creatures. And together we continue to learn about how they see the world and how they are involved and what we can do to support them, and what we know from history.
Thank you. I just like to
Hi, this is
follow
Susan
up
Arshak
with
speaking. I have come to you for years, and my air conditioning seems unprepared for summer.
Somebody needs to
When we
mute
turn it
their
on,
Susan.
there's
mute
no
their
cold
phone,
air.
please.
So can I?
There you go.
There you go.
Let me simply follow up with Pat Boswell and say that your brother's work, Christianity, Homosexuality, and Social Tolerance, is, I believe, one of the greatest books published in my lifetime. And I knew your dear brother with his baseball cap and his beautiful calligraphy, and I miss him dearly, and I'm sure you do as well. One of the great church historians of our lifetime. So may he rest in peace, a great man. The floor is open. Who's next? I have a list of questions as long as my arm, but I'll stand back for a minute.
Just like
Yes,
to
Jeanette,
say,
go ahead,
hel-
Susan.
I would just like to say hello. This is a fabulous conversation. Jeanette, was drawn to the Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South by my personal psychological counselor when I was a little bit burned out as a Presbyterian minister. And I never knew you came through the Presbyterian thing. And I also have written a memoir that I published in 2020. And part of that memoir is all the men telling me that women can't be ministers.
Mhm.
And oh my gosh, I just feel like, how could I not have known all of y'all for 40 years? Because I'm just a little bit younger than you, and I've been on that road. I've been a mission co-worker for the Presbyterian Church, and I always push the envelope. I haven't created an organization, but I want to connect to this organization. I am just officially retired and feel free in retirement to work for the one who calls us all, without the in-between structures that try to tell you how to do it, when to do it, why to do it, and not to do it. And I'm just so grateful for this, that I connected with this group today. So thank you. I just wanted to get to know you better, being more involved. And I would love to give you a copy of my memoir too.
Good.
But anyway, thank you for being here and for offering this today. Yay.
Susan, where have you landed geographically?
I am in Southern Pines, North Carolina. I'm a fellow
know, right.
North Carolinian.
I know right where you are. Thank you so much.
And I'll be up to
You're-
visit one of these days.
Good.
You're watching our organizations, and you're watching in real time what organizations do. They
Great.
don't call us the Alliance for nothing, and they don't call it the Center for nothing either. So go ahead. The next will be Sandra Smith, who's own Holy Ground work is known to us.
Thank you for this gathering, Mary and Water folks, and Jeanette and all of you who have been in this work. Thank you for persisting. We've all benefited. So a lot of gratefulness in my heart right now. And I think, Jeanette, you've just been so supportive of me over the years and grateful to you. And I'm wondering, you made the road as you go. What now? What's a kernel of wisdom from that road you've traveled? What changed you the most? What changed you? Maybe not the most, but one thing that really shifted something in you.
Well, I think one thing that I've learned over and over again, which is not really new, but is startlingly apparent at this moment in historical time, is something that I heard Rosemary Ruther say a long time ago, and that I used in a little postcard. Oh, I used in a benediction when I was finally ordained 5 years after I graduated from seminary. That's another story in the book. Rosemary said that we cannot, something like, we cannot look to the perfect Eden of the past or to some imagined heaven of the future, but we each have to make a revolution for our own generation. And so that's what we thought we did 50 years ago. Silly people, we thought we were done. It was really only the beginning. And so for people in every generation on this call, that's our job, to figure out how to bring the voice of mercy and justice and equity into our world. So what now is, Sandra, what I think I mentioned a minute ago, which is supporting other people. I'm 71, I'll be 72 this year. And I think our job as we age is to both lead folks in our generation and do whatever we can to support the young people, to support the younger people. I mean, after George Floyd was murdered, the young people of color and queer people who were out in the streets needed all kinds of support. And so whether we can send peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, well wishes, or money, I think that our job as those of us who are elders now is to support. What changed me? Oh, well, this is not actually a change. It's another thing I learned, was an instinct from a long time ago, that if you stick with something for a long time, I learned this like in, I don't know, in elementary school. I kept running for office and not getting elected, but I just kept doing it. And then finally they let me have some elected role, you know. Staying with issues, staying with friends, keeping some connection to family, that a little bit of at a time, over a long period of time, we can make connections, make change, and sometimes even influence people that we disagree with. So I wrote a book called Just Keep Going, which is about writing, but it's also about just keep sticking with it. Thank you. And thank you for the work of Holy Ground. It was just wonderful to come to Asheville and do programs there and attend programs.
Thanks, Jeanette. And I would just reflect that you always eat your breakfast cereal in the same bowl. And that's always been that always impressed me, with someone who could really stick with things. If you could eat your breakfast cereal every day.
Right, Sandra, it's a 6 characteristic, right? Yes, Sandra is an expert Enneagram teacher. And yeah, a lot of the things I
probably
do.
have their own cereal bowl. I'm going to ask Carolyn Maynard and Ann McCall to make the last 2 comments before Mary Yelenick will get to you when we right after we officially close. Okay, you'll be first right after the close. So go ahead, Carolyn and Ann, be brief, and then we'll close out, and then Jeanette will continue, hopefully continue conversation for a few minutes with us, and Mary Yelenick will have the first dibs on that. Go ahead.
Cool. The last question helped answer what I was going to ask, which was, how did you sustain yourself during that? Establishing the nonprofit and keeping with it. And I just think it's in your DNA deeply. And I just wanted to thank you for establishing where you figured out what you needed, and then you asked people if they'd like to share in that need. And that has to do with the week of quiet and writing, those that are held at Salter Path. And so I just wanted to say how much it's added to my life, going and being in what turns into a small instant community of richness and great fun. So
Thank you,
Is that-
Carolyn. Let me say that for the first 20 years of the Resource Center in that was, my 30s and up to almost 40 years of age, I worked just as hard and fast as I could. And then I burned out and I went away for 2 years. And when I came back, I said, okay, we're going to do smaller programs. We're going to do more programs around spiritual practice, and we're not going to burn ourselves out. And when we run out of people, ideas, and money, we will stop. That hasn't happened yet. But, it took some learning that I think a lot of people probably have that experience. You get someplace in the middle and you can't push that hard. Anne?
Hey, Jeanette.
Hey,
I appreciate having been in community with you on issues of race, and it made me wonder, in your own development, where has Black feminist theology or womanist theology been most influential to you?
So I was in seminary when the first wave of Black feminist theologians or womanist theologians, not everybody agrees on the terms, were studying with James Cone at Union Theological Seminary. So they were PhD students like Katie Cannon, and they enormously influential. I mean, I think that the Black feminist theologians saying, no, what the men said wasn't right, exactly, didn't include us, and no, what the women had to say did not include, what the white women had to say did not include us. And the perspective that they brought out of lived experience and the history of enslavement in this country is invaluable, because as Hannah Nicole Jones says in the 1619 Project, there's Black people in this country who've been fighting for democracy for 400 years. And Black feminist theologians and womanist theologians point that out in lots of different ways. The theology that I inherited as a divinity student was almost entirely white, Northern European male perspective on the world, which, if you look at the globe, is, about just this teeny little piece of it, but they claimed to know the truth. And so each of the additional voices that's been added to the theological conversation makes it closer to a representation of what we think of as justice and the holy, and what the Creator would want for this world. Of the additions, I think that womanist theology has probably been the most influential on me. Yeah.
Jeanette, I'm going to thank you so kindly for this and for this wonderful time together. Several people have already put in the chat what a wonderful experience it was to be with you. And I echo that and thank you and your colleagues at the Resource Center for Women in Ministry in the South for all that you do and all that will come in the future from that work. I also want to simply mention one more time the book, Making the Road as We Go. I highly recommend it. We have really just dusted over the surface of it today. There's so much richness here and so many things to talk about.